I did not wake up planning to lose my mind over the color of my grass. But when an association tells you to repaint your lawn in 72 hours, or else, something inside even the quietest dad starts to rattle. It still sounds ridiculous when I say it. Yet that countdown clock in my head was as loud as a fire alarm. The day it really started, the desert sun was already climbing, turning the pavement into a dull silver mirror. Our subdivision, Sonoran Bluffs, sat out on the edge of town like a beige mirage, a grid of cul-de-sacs and stucco meant to blend into sand. Every house had the same basic palette. Tan walls, brown roof, river rock in carefully graded mounds that were supposed to pass for landscaping. The only real color on our street came from my front yard, and that was the problem. My grass was not supposed to exist here. The original developer had put down a postage stamp of drought-tolerant turf in front of each house as a luxury nod to greenery. Then the board later moved toward what they called low-visibility greens. Most neighbors eventually killed theirs off and replaced it with gravel or fake turf that matched the approved color sheet, a strip of swatches that all looked like variations of dust. I kept mine alive, deep green, a square of stubborn life in a neighborhood that worshiped beige. I am not the type who goes looking for a fight. I work from home in IT, keep my head down, pay my dues, coach my son's weekend soccer, and hope the car starts every Monday. If the association wanted to argue about mailbox hinges or trash cans left out too long, I usually just fixed it and moved on. But the lawn was different, because it was one of the only things that actually made this place feel like a home instead of a desert holding cell. The first sign that my patch of green had become a problem was not even a letter. It was the way Paula started slowing down in front of my house. Paula was the chair of the Architectural Review Committee, but everyone on our street privately referred to her as our neighborhood Karen, the self-appointed queen of curb appeal. She walked every morning with a clipboard that never left her hand, her visor angled like a sundial pointing toward the next infraction. At first, I tried to give her the benefit of the doubt. Maybe she liked my lawn. Maybe she was thinking about asking who my landscaper was, or what fertilizer I used. But she never waved, never smiled, just stared at the grass and scribbled something down, the way a teacher notes a failing grade. A week later, the first piece of evidence showed up, a pale yellow slip stuck under my front door like a forgotten receipt. At the top, in block letters, it read Courtesy Landscape Reminder. Under that was a line printed in bold. Please review Community Standards Handbook, Section 5.2, Approved Front Yard Color Palette. Someone had circled 5.2 with a neat little loop, like they wanted to make sure I did not miss it. I remember standing in the entryway with that paper in my hand, feeling the cool air from the AC on my back while the heat pressed against the door. The note did not say anything specifically about my grass, but it did not have to. Section 5.2 might as well have been a personal letter. That section showed the samples. A fan of beige, tan, cream, and a color they called desert sage green that looked nothing like my lawn. The message was clear. Anything visible from the street had to fall within that range of muted safety. I put the slip on the kitchen counter next to the salt and pepper, telling myself it was nothing. They called it a courtesy reminder. After all, I had never seen anyone get fined over a first slip, but the phrase itself stuck in my head. The way they phrased it like my front yard was an attitude problem instead of square grass. Approved front yard color palette. As if we were painting a mural instead of trying to keep plants alive in the desert. The next morning when I stepped outside, the air was still cool enough that you could almost pretend the day would be kind. The grass was damp from the sprinklers, and there was a faint smell of wet soil, rich and earthy, out of place in this endless rock garden. I stood there and thought about all the things that patch of green had seen. My kids chasing each other with foam swords, the time my daughter lay on her back and tried to count the stars, the sound of my own dad's voice on the phone when I first told him I had bought a house with real grass out front. I was not ready to let a handbook and a color swatch erase all of that, so I did what any reasonable person would do. I pulled out the Community Standards Handbook, sat at the table, and read Section 5.2 like it was a mystery novel. The wording was careful and vague, written to sound friendly, but give the board full control. It talked about visual harmony with the surrounding desert environment, avoiding stark contrasts, and the need to minimize reflective surfaces and high saturation hues. There was one sentence that made me pause. It said, "Deviations may be permitted at the sole discretion of the Architectural Review Committee, provided they do not create an undue visual focal point." That phrase, undue visual focal point, felt like it had my address printed underneath. I realized my lawn did not just fail to blend in. It stood out, a green exclamation point in a paragraph of sand. I told myself that was not a crime, but in Sonoran Bluffs, standing out was its own kind of offense. What I did not know yet was that Paula was already framing my lawn as an act of defiance instead of a patch of color. In her mind, this was not about water usage or shade. It was about control. That was the moment that started to shift from a simple complaint into the kind of HOA ridiculous rules that turn into a full HOA revenge story. The second notice did not call itself a courtesy anything. It arrived in a plain white envelope with the association's logo stamped in the corner, delivered with the rest of the mail one hot Thursday afternoon. The metal mailbox burned my fingers when I opened it, and the envelope inside felt heavy even though it was only a few pages. I knew, before I even slid it open at the kitchen counter, that this one would not be gentle. Inside, there was a formal heading, Landscape Noncompliance Notice, First Violation. Under that, in smaller print, it cited CCR Section 5.2, Front Yard Color Palette and Landscaping Materials, and listed my address. The letter described my grass as unapproved high-saturation live turf and claimed it created a visual inconsistency with community's desert aesthetic. At the bottom, in a neat little box, it gave me 10 days to bring the property into compliance before fines could begin. I stared at that phrase, "bring the property into compliance," and something inside me hardened. There was no mention of how much water I used, no accusation about sprinklers running at the wrong time, no concern about waste. It was about color. They wanted my grass to look less alive, not to use less water. I went outside, letter in hand, and looked at the yard the way they must have. The sun was higher now, making the grass glow almost unreal in the harsh light. Next door, the neighbors a yard of crushed rock and 2 plastic agave plants bolted into place, their colors already faded by the sun. Down the street, I could see a handful of artificial lawns in that uniform sage tone, all lined up like samples in a catalog. Standing there, my sneakers in the cool damp blades, I tried to imagine painting this patch of life in some pale, dusty spray, just to make the committee happy. The idea felt absurd and a little depressing. When I walked back to the house, the AC hit me like a wall, but my chest still felt tight. My kids were in the living room, sprawled on the floor, and I realized I was already weighing what kind of example I wanted to set for them. I did not want them to see me roll over for every unreasonable rule. At the same time, I knew this was not a movie where someone gives an inspiring speech and the board suddenly changes its mind. Real life in an association is paperwork, meetings, and rules written in small, dense text. If I was going to push back, I had to be careful, quiet, and precise. That night, after the kids went to bed and the house settled into that soft hum of appliances and distant traffic, I opened my laptop. I started with the basics: turf dye, water usage, local regulations on landscaping in HOA communities. I took notes on anything that looked like it might matter, anything that might become evidence later if this turned into a real battle. I was not ready to admit it yet, but a part of me had already accepted that we were headed toward conflict. I also pulled in my digital copy of the CC and RS and read Section 5.2 again, this time slowly, highlighting all the phrases that felt slippery. Visual harmony, community aesthetic, undue focal point. No exact color codes, no specific ban on live turf, nothing that explicitly said grass had to be beige or fake. The more I looked at the wording, the more it felt like the rules were written to be a weapon for whoever had the most time and the strongest opinions. A few days later, I got my first glimpse of how seriously Paula was taking this. I saw her standing across the street with her phone angled at my yard, taking slow, deliberate photos from different corners of the sidewalk. Her clipboard was tucked under one arm, and she kept looking from the lawn to the screen, zooming in, making sure every blade of grass was recorded. She did not even try to hide it. In her mind, this was a documented infraction, not a neighbor's home. I wanted to walk out and ask what she was doing. I wanted to tell her that my water usage was under the community average, that the grass gave my kids a place to play where they would not shred their knees. Instead, I stayed inside, watching through the front window, and picked up my phone. If she was going to document, then so was I. I took my own pictures, starting with close-ups of the soil, showing the drip lines we had installed to make the watering more efficient. I photographed the meter readings on my water bill and saved them in a folder. I even snapped a photo of the page in a handbook where Section 5.2 lived, underlining that vague sentence about deviations allowed at the discretion of committee. It felt like overkill in the moment, but I had a quiet hunch this was evidence I would need later. What I did not know, standing there with my phone full of pictures of my lawn still shining bright green, was that the next notice would not give me 10 days. It would give me 72 hours, and it would be taped to my front door like a countdown pasted over my entire life. The notice that finally snapped everything into place did not arrive in the mail. It arrived slapped against my front door like a warning label on a toxic product. I found it when I came home from a grocery run, one plastic bag cutting into my fingers, the other swinging against my leg in the dry heat. The paper was bright orange this time, impossible to miss. The tape curling slightly at the edges where the sun had already started to get at it. At the top, in bold letters, it said Final Notice, Immediate Landscape Compliance. Under that, they had typed my name and address, as if I were a business violating some public ordinance, instead a guy trying to keep a little grass alive for his kids. The wording was harsher than anything I had received before, all references to continued noncompliance, prior communication, and failure to meet previously communicated expectations. Halfway down the page, I hit the line that made my stomach drop. 72 hours to repaint or replace the visible turf with an approved neutral tone or gravel equivalent. If I did not, it said, fines will begin to accrue at a rate of $100 per day, not to exceed $2,000 prior to legal escalation. The phrase legal escalation sat there like a shadow, vague and heavy at the same time. I stared at those numbers, doing the math without meaning to, seeing the grocery money and car payment turning into penalties over a lawn. By the time I stepped inside, the cool blast from the AC could not touch the heat building behind my eyes. I set the groceries on the counter without unpacking them and spread the orange notice flat with both hands. In the bottom corner, the date was typed in small font. Dated June 3rd. Someone had initialed it with narrow loop that I recognized from the earlier courtesy slip. It was Paula's signature, neat and satisfied. I took out my phone and added the paper to my growing evidence folder. The photo captured the creases from where the wind had tried to peel it off the door, the tape stretched in white streaks. Then I turned the notice over and saw, stapled to the back, a list of 3 preferred vendors who could come out and apply pigment or convert to approved materials on short notice. There were prices next to each one, pre-negotiated rates that made it very clear someone on the board had been planning this step for a while. When I finally sat down at the table, my hands were shaking just enough to make the paper rustle. I read the notice again, this time paying close attention to the part that mentioned repaint. There was no technical explanation, no description of what exactly repainting a lawn even meant in their minds. It simply assumed I would either spray color my grass into submission or rip it out and replace it with the rocks and muted turf they loved. The quiet part of me, the one that hated conflict, suggested I just call one of the listed vendors, get it over with, pay the bill, and move on with life. But another part, the part that had been documenting, reading, and highlighting for weeks, saw something else. They were using fine print and carefully vague language as a tool to push me into paying money to fix a problem they had invented. I went back to my laptop and opened the CC and RS again. Section 5.2 still said nothing about live turf being prohibited outright, only about color harmony and avoiding high saturation. Nothing in there said I had to use their vendors either. The more I looked, the more it felt like they were overstepping, banking on the idea that most people would not notice the difference between rule and a threat dressed up as procedure. Over the next few days, small things around the neighborhood started to change. I caught neighbors slowing their cars when they passed our house, eyes flicking toward the lawn and then toward the house, where that bright orange notice had hung for 2 full days before I took it inside. I heard snippets of conversations cut short when I stepped into the cul-de-sac. Kids who used to run across our yard without a second thought now skirted the edge of the sidewalk, looking at the grass like it might bite them. Inside our own home, the mood shifted too. My wife asked what the notice meant for our budget in a tone that held more worry than anger. My son, who was old enough to read the bold letters, asked if we were in trouble with the neighborhood, his voice small but serious. I found myself saying things like it'll be fine, and we'll figure out, while a second voice in my head kept tallying each fine day like a metronome. The 72 hours ticked by faster than I wanted them to. On the last day, with the sun high and the shadows sharp, Paula walked past again with her clipboard. She paused in front of our yard longer than usual, writing something down, her visor tilted down to block the glare. I could feel the countdown finishing even before anything official arrived. The first fine notice, when it came, was not colorful like the others. It was a simple white printout, folded into a standard envelope with the association letterhead at the top. Inside, there was a one-page sheet labeled Assessment of Monetary Penalty, Landscape Noncompliance. Under my name and address was a line item, Day 1, $100. That was the moment the whole situation shifted from annoyance to real stakes. They were not just threatening anymore. They were charging. A ledger had begun somewhere in a spreadsheet, with my address at the top and a column of numbers they expected me to pay. It dawned on me that if I did nothing, those numbers could grow big enough to reach into places I could not ignore, like savings or credit, or even my ability to stay in a house at all. I started waking up earlier, not out of choice, but because my brain refused to sleep past sunrise. Light would creep through the blinds, and before my eyes even fully opened, I would see the words monetary penalty printed in my mind. I got up, made coffee, and watched through the front window as the neighborhood went through its routine. It felt like I was seeing it all through glass now, slightly removed, a spectator in my own street. Paula's walks became more theatrical. Sometimes she brought another board member, a man with a permanent squint, who carried a tablet instead of a clipboard. They would stop, look at the lawn, tap on the screen, and walk on. No one knocked. No one spoke to me. They let the paper speak for them. I kept collecting evidence. I printed the original courtesy landscape reminder, the first landscape noncompliance notice, and now the final notice. Immediate landscape compliance, dated June 3rd, stacking them in a folder like a slow-motion timeline. On each, I highlighted the sections of CCR Section 5.2 they claimed I was violating, then scribbled notes in the margins with questions and observations. I added a new document to the front, a simple sheet with the heading Fine Ledger, where I tracked each day and the amount they said I owed in my own handwriting. At the same time, I began paying more attention to other yards. I noticed a house 2 streets over that had installed bright blue ceramic planters at the corner of their driveway, the color so intense it practically hummed in the sunlight. Another neighbor had painted their front door a deep teal that definitely did not match any of the approved swatches in our handbook. Yet, as far as I could tell, there were no orange notices taped to their doors. This was not about color alone. It was about who the board had decided to focus on. Maybe it had started with Paula simply not liking the look of our lawn, but now it had become something else, something more personal. The more I saw, the more it felt like they were testing how far they could push, how much they could demand before I broke down and became just another compliant lot number. Instead, each new notice and each ignored violation elsewhere pushed me closer to something I never expected, pushing back. I decided to attend the next board meeting. The agenda, which came in the mail in a thin packet, listed my issue as a single line item, discussion and possible fine authorization, Lot 27, turf color noncompliance. The date at the top read June 15th. I circled it and slid the agenda into my evidence folder like another piece of the puzzle. I did not announce to anyone that I was going. On the night of the meeting, the desert sky turned a deep purple as the heat slowly bled out of the pavement. The board met in a small, over-air-conditioned room at the front of the development, the kind of place where beige folding chairs and a humming ceiling vent set the entire tone. I walked in quietly, signed my name on the visitor sheet, and sat near the back, holding my folder like a shield. The meeting was dull at first. They talked about pool maintenance, security patrol schedules, and a minor argument about decorative holiday flags that ran longer than it should have. I listened, but my mind kept jumping ahead to the line where my address appeared. By the time they reached it, my palms were damp, and my fingers had left faint smudges on the manila folder. When they discussed my lawn, they did so as if I were not in the room. They described a persistently non-compliant turf installation and mentioned multiple attempts to offer remedy options, each phrase more one-sided than the last. They did not mention my emails asking clarifying questions or the pictures I had sent showing the water-efficient drip lines under the grass. They spoke in clipped, formal phrases that reduced my home to a bullet point. The board voted unanimously to continue fines until the property achieved visual harmony with surrounding lots. No one turned around to look at me when they did it. When the motion passed, a small note was scribbled on a printed agenda next to my address, like another tally mark in their system. I walked out without saying a word, but inside, something had shifted from frustration to resolve. From that night on, the tempo of the conflict changed. Fine notices became regular, arriving every few days with updated totals. After a week, my self-made ledger showed $700 in penalties. By the end of the second week, the number had crossed $1,000, the ink heavier each time I wrote it. Along with the fines, the tone of the letters grew colder. One notice cited potential lien activity. If the balance remained unpaid beyond a certain threshold, though it did not specify the exact number that would trigger it. Another reminded me that continued noncompliance may affect the association's perception of your lot's standing within the community. The wording was careful but carried that unmistakable hint. We can make things very uncomfortable for you. I spent late nights reading up on what they could and could not actually do. I did not want legal advice so much as clarity, a sense of the edges of their power. What I learned was both reassuring and alarming. They could not simply throw us out, but they could stack enough fines and legal fees on top of each other to make our lives a financial maze. Somewhere between the line about potential lien activity and my own tally crossing $1,500, I realized that if I did nothing, this would not just be a turf fight. It could become the story of how a patch of grass turned into a threat against our entire house. The money at risk was no longer theoretical. I could see it when I checked our accounts and mentally shifted funds from savings to just-in-case piles. I could feel it when my wife asked, in a quiet moment, whether this was going to affect our plans for a summer trip with the kids. We were not wealthy, and every dollar I paid to them over this would be one we did not use for something that actually mattered. At the same time, I had started to notice ripples on the social side of the neighborhood. The association published a monthly newsletter, a glossy little booklet with photos of decorated porches and neighbor spotlights. One issue arrived with a column on maintaining community aesthetics, which included a paragraph about the challenges posed by non-compliant landscaping choices. There were no names mentioned, but the phrasing and the description of bright, high-saturation turf left little doubt who they meant. That column changed the way people looked at us. At the pool, a few parents who used the chat easily now gave short, polite nods and went back to their phones. Kids told my son that their parents said our lawn was against the rules, as if it were some kind of moral failure. The board had not just put money at stake. They had started turning the social screws too. I did what I always did when I felt cornered. I gathered more information. I went back through every document they had sent me, every clause in the CC and RS that touched on landscaping, aesthetics, or fines. I noted how often they used words like may and at the discretion of the board instead of solid, measurable requirements. I cross-referenced my photos of other non-compliant features in the community and tagged them with dates and house numbers. One afternoon, while going to the fine print again, I noticed a smaller section of the CC and RS that I had skipped over before. It was Section 9.4, Title Variances and Unique Installations. Buried in there was a sentence that said the board could approve distinctive natural or artistic features that served as accent elements, provided they did not interfere with safety or utility functions. There was nothing in that section about color. That sentence planted a seed in my mind. An accent element, I thought, is still a focal point. If they could approve a bright sculpture or a mural as a distinctive feature, Then why did my grass automatically count as an unapproved focal point instead of potential variance? It was the first time I saw a path that did not involve me backing down or paying up. I also found something interesting in the board meeting packet from June 15th. At the back, there was a printed copy of the agenda with handwritten notes, probably a leftover from someone on the board who had used it as a working copy before stuffing it into the file box. Next to my agenda item, Lot 27, turf color noncompliance, someone had written in the margin, use as example in next newsletter. I photocopied that page and slid it into the evidence folder, labeling it Board Agenda Excerpt June 15th. That scribbled note confirmed what I had suspected. They were not just enforcing rules. They were turning me into a cautionary tale, a public example of what happens when you do not fall in line. In doing so, they had overplayed their hand. They had given me something concrete, on paper, that showed intent beyond simple enforcement. By this point, I was several weeks into fines over lawn that technically violated no written color code, with a growing evidence folder of notices, highlighted CCR sections, meeting agendas, and photos of other inconsistent yards. The board had shifted from quiet reminders to daily penalties, newsletter shade, and hints of future liens, while I quietly documented every step and began searching for a way to use their own words and their own rules against them. The turning point came in the form of an invitation, though that is a generous word for it. Another envelope arrived, this one labeled Hearing Notice, Architectural Review Committee. Inside, it stated that I was requested to appear on July 2nd at 6:30 p.m. to discuss ongoing landscape noncompliance and potential resolution options. It also noted that failure to appear may result in further fines without additional hearing. On its face, it sounded like a chance to plead my case. But the more I read, the more it felt like they were setting up a formality, a staged moment where they could check the box that said homeowner was given an opportunity to comply. I knew if I walked in unprepared, they would use my silence or frustration as another justification to keep the fines coming. So I treated it the way I treated a tough project at work. I prepared. I printed everything again, this time in a clean, organized stack. At the front, I placed a cover sheet titled Lot 27, Turf Color Documentation. Behind that, I included copies of the courtesy reminder, the first and second noncompliance notices, the final notice dated June 3rd, and the list of preferred vendors attached to it. Then came the fine ledger I had kept, showing the incremental growth from $100 to $1,800. After that, I inserted the photocopy of the board agenda excerpt with that handwritten note about using my lot as an example in the newsletter. I highlighted the line and wrote in the margin, public use of individual lot details as cautionary content. Finally, I printed Section 5.2 and Section 9.4 of the CC and RS, highlighting the vague phrases and the variance clause. It looked, in the end, less like a neighbor dispute and more like a small case file. On the evening of July 2nd, the heat clung to the asphalt outside, even as the sky dimmed to a gentle orange. The hearing took place in the same front office as the earlier board meeting, but this time in a smaller side room with a long table and 3 chairs on one side. I sat on the other side, my folder in front of me, and waited as Paula and 2 other committee members filtered in, shuffling papers. The fluorescent lights above hummed softly, a thin, almost irritating sound that made the room feel tense. They began the session with formal language, noting the time, the date, and the purpose of the hearing. They summarized their view that my lawn created an unapproved focal point, that I had been given ample time and options to comply, and that fines had been assessed according to the schedule in the governing documents. They repeated phrases from the notices as if that alone made them irrefutable. When they paused, looking at me expectantly, I opened my folder. I did not raise my voice or make any dramatic speeches. I calmly walked them through the documents, one by one, summarizing their own words back to them. I pointed out that Section 5.2 did not specify color codes, that Section 9.4 allowed for distinctive features as variances, and that my water usage report showed lower consumption than some rock-only yards due to efficient scheduling. Then I slid the agenda excerpt forward, gently tapping the highlighted marginal note about using my lot as an example in the newsletter. There was a moment, just a flicker, where I saw something shift on Paula's face. Surprise, maybe, or annoyance at being confronted with their own handwriting. She recovered quickly, reverting to phrases about maintaining standards and avoiding a slippery slope. But I had already seen what I needed. They were not used to someone showing up with receipts. The committee did not make any decisions on the spot. They said they would take the information under advisement and review the matter further. But as I left the room, the air outside felt different. The heat was still there, but there was also a breeze, carrying the smell of dust and distant creosote, like a storm might be thinking about forming. After the hearing, the fines did not stop immediately, but something about their rhythm changed. The notices came a little less often, the language slightly less aggressive, as if they were hesitating. At the same time, the social pressure around us ratcheted up. The next newsletter ran a photo of a model-compliant yard that looked suspiciously like Paula's, with a caption about community pride and our unified look. Neighbors began asking my kids why our yard wasn't fixed yet. One morning, I found a scribbled note shoved into our mailbox that simply said, "Rules are rules. You're making it harder for everyone." My son started refusing to play in the front yard, preferring the privacy of the backyard where the association's eyes did not reach. It stung to realize that what had been a place of carefree play was now a stage for judgment. It was in that mix of money pressure, quiet isolation, and public shaming that I realized I was done just defending myself. If they were going to turn my family into a lesson for neighborhood, then I was going to choose a lesson, and it would not be the one they had in mind. The first part of my plan was simple: stop reacting and start directing. They had chosen the battlefield, but I could still choose the angle. If they want to make everything about aesthetics, then I would meet them there with receipts, plants, and their own rules turned inside out. I did not want to become the guy shouting about freedom in a beige lobby. I wanted to be the guy who showed, on paper, how far they had pushed past their own lines. I went back to the research I had started weeks earlier on plant-safe dyes. There were products meant to revive dormant grass, pigments that could tint blades without killing them, used by golf courses and sports fields. I dug deeper, looking for formulas that would tone down the intensity of the green without turning it into the exact washed-out beige they wanted. If I was going to alter my lawn, even temporarily, it would be on my terms, not according to a vendor list stapled to an orange notice. I ordered a small batch of plant-safe dye that promised to darken and even out color. When it arrived, I tested a tiny corner of the lawn first, carefully following the instructions and checking the blades over the next few days. The results surprised me. The grass looked deeper, more uniform, still clearly alive but less like a neon sign. It seemed like the kind of reasonable compromise any fair committee would have welcomed if they were actually concerned about visual harmony instead of total control. At the same time, I started talking quietly to neighbors. Not a campaign, not a loud crusade, just casual conversations at the mailbox or at the community pool. Questions slipped into moments that felt natural. Had they ever gotten notices that felt unfair? Did they know about Section 9.4, the variance clause, or about the fine schedule buried at the back of the CC and RS? I discovered something the board probably hoped most residents would never compare. Several people had received petty warnings, small reminders about trash cans and porch decor, but very few had been charged ongoing daily fines. More interestingly, at least 3 homeowners admitted they had features that technically did not match the approved color palette. Bright planters, bold front doors, even a painted bench in the courtyard. None of them had gotten a final notice taped to their door, much less a daily penalty. These conversations were not just gossip. They were data. I kept a simple list of addresses and features, along with dates, building a quiet case for selective enforcement. I never promised anyone a specific outcome or told them what to do. I just listened and asked if they would be willing to sign something if it came to that. Most said yes, with the weary tone of people who had lived with a small, constant pressure and did not realize how much it bothered them until someone asked. Back at home, I applied the dye evenly across my lawn one calm evening, when the wind had died down and the air fell heavy. In the sodium glow of the streetlights, the grass shifted into a darker, more subtle green that blended a little more with the surrounding rocks. It still did not match the approved swatches, but it no longer shouted from down the block. It looked like what it should have always been considered, a distinctive natural feature, not a crime scene. A few days later, I took new photos from the sidewalk and the street corners, just like Paula had done weeks before. I printed them and clipped them to the front of my stack of documents, labeled Post-Eye Appearance, June 28th. Underneath, I attached a copy of Section 9.4 with the phrase distinctive natural or artistic features highlighted. I want to be very clear. I had made a documented effort to find middle ground, and they had a written mechanism to approve it. When the next fine notice still arrived, ignoring the change entirely, I knew we had crossed into pure stubbornness. The amount at the top had crept just past $2,000, and this time there was a new attachment. It was a one-page reminder of lien authority, citing a section of state law and warning that unpaid sums may be subject to collection and lien recording. The board had moved from money pressure into the realm of long-term consequences, betting that the fear of a mark against our property would break us. Instead of backing down, that new threat gave me the last piece I needed. If they were willing to waive lien threats over a lawn that fit no clear rule, then they were willing to put the entire association's reputation at risk, and that meant their own positions had finally become vulnerable. My retaliation was not a single dramatic gesture. It was a series of quiet moves lined up so that when one fell, the rest would follow. The first was a petition, written in calm, neutral language that described a pattern of selective enforcement and vague rules around landscaping. It did not even mention my name. It referred to recent turf-related fines and the use of examples in newsletters, citing the board agenda excerpt June 15th as evidence. I took it door to door, along with a short packet of anonymized photos, showing non-approved features that had never been cited. I framed it not as a crusade against the board, but as a request for clarity and fairness. If we were going to have rules, they should be specific, enforceable, and applied consistently to everyone. If the board could approve variances for some, they should be willing to clearly explain why others were denied. Many people signed not because they loved my lawn, but because they recognized how easily their own homes could become the next example. Within a week, I had more than enough signatures to meet the threshold in the governing documents for member-initiated agenda items. I filled out the official form, stapled the petition to it, and delivered both to the management office with a simple note: Corridor request to add member proposal, landscaping variances and enforcement review to next annual meeting agenda. I did not need to threaten anything. The documents themselves spelled out that the board had to acknowledge such a request. The second move was more targeted. I wrote a calm, detailed letter addressed to the property management company and the association's attorney, not asking for legal advice, but requesting clarification. I included copies of the final notice dated June 3rd, the fine ledger showing daily penalties exceeding $2,000, and photographs of my post-eye lawn. I asked, in straightforward language, how these actions align with CCR Section 5.2 and Section 9.4, and whether treatable homeowners My lawn remained. I kept the deeper, toned-down green that the dye had created, more out of preference now than defiance. We adjusted the watering schedule to keep it healthy but modest, and I planted a border of native shrubs around the edges, tying it visually into the desert landscape. When the new rules were finally drafted months later, they contained specific color ranges, clear variance criteria, and a short clause that might as well have been written directly over my front yard. Distinctive natural features may be approved where water efficient and maintained in a manner consistent with community safety. Paula did not disappear, but her influence shifted. At the next election cycle, she lost her position as committee chair, replaced by someone who openly talked about balance between individual expression and community standards. She still walked the neighborhood, visor on, but the clipboard was gone, replaced by a simple notepad that she tucked away most of the time. If she slowed in front of my house now, it was not with the same cold intensity, more like someone looking at a chapter from a story they had misread the first time. Inside our home, the pressure eased. My son started playing in the front yard again, turning somersaults across the grass as the evening light softened. Neighbors who had once kept their distance now stopped to chat, some to ask how the new rules worked, others to quietly thank me for pushing back. We were no longer the cautionary tale. We had become proof that the board could be questioned, that power in a homeowners association drama did not have to flow only one way. I kept the evidence folder, even after everything was resolved. Inside, the final notice dated June 3rd, Saturday, beside the board agenda, excerpt from June 15th, the fine ledger, the photos, and the petition. It felt less like a weapon now and more like a reminder of what quiet persistence can do. There was satisfaction in knowing that the same documents that had once made me feel cornered had become the tools of a satisfying revenge story instead. Share your own beige grass HOA horror in one sharp line. Next time, the story is not about grass at all. It is about parking. A quiet family on a narrow cul-de-sac wakes up to find every car they own tagged for street obstruction, even though they are parked exactly where the community map once told them to park. A new security contractor, eager to prove their worth, starts treating guest vehicles like open invitations to invoice, and an entire row of houses finds out that the board has quietly changed the rules without updating the diagrams pinned to their garages. One homeowner begins tracking each ticket, comparing timestamps, patrol routes, and the original parking plan filed with the county, slowly piecing together a pattern that makes the fines look less like safety and more like opportunity.